Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. In past episodes of Business Matters, we've looked at a little bit of science, a little bit of technology, and a lot of economics. Today, let's dive a wee bit into history and some business. Today's topic is, what do the Tata Group's moves with their airline subsidiaries mean for the Indian aviation sector? The Center for Asia Pacific Aviation India, or CAPA India, it's an aviation advisory firm, seems to think that this consolidation that's happening within the Tata Group for aviation would lead to a duopoly in the Indian aviation sector. What that means is, in a few years from now, a majority of the market would be controlled by two players, namely Air India Group within the Tata Group and IndiGo. CAPA India predicts that the duo would eventually control between 75 and 80% of the domestic aviation market. And for servicing of international markets, that is, international flights to and from India, the market share would go up from 37.8% now to above 50% eventually. So historically, this international market being serviced from India has been controlled by foreign carriers, and that dominance would eventually move to Indian carriers, is the prediction. A little bit of history before we dive deep into the context behind these predictions. The transatlantic route, that is a flight route between the US and Europe, is likely historically the most traveled international route. But commercial flights weren't this common. Airlines were beginning to experiment with these late 1920s and some part of the 30s. In fact, the first time a world political leader ever attempted such a flight was British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill when he returned to the UK after a 3-week summit in Washington with US President Roosevelt. These conversations in Washington likely set the course for the strategy for the Allies as to how they would repulse the Axis. This was in Jan 1942. In his exhaustive account of the Second World War, Sir Winston Churchill specifically dwells on this particular flight. He sounds almost fascinated by the luxury he finds about this flight with regard to both dining and slumber. In fact, the Royal Air Force pilots let him have control of the aircraft for a short distance as well. As a flight neared the British Isles, in error, they flew too close to a heavily defended German naval base in the north of France, in Germany-occupied France, and they barely escaped from there. And as they came nearer the United Kingdom, a navigational error meant that they approached their country from a path that was not originally intended for them. As a result of which, the Royal Squadron thought this was a German assault and dispatched a few Hurricane aircraft to shoot this plane down. Fortunately, as Sir Winston Churchill curtly noticed later, these planes missed spotting his own aircraft. Of course, there are a lot of opinions on what Sir Winston Churchill could have done better for India, especially during the Second World War, but that's for another conversation altogether. The point I'm making is this. This flight that he wrote about was January 1942, and we had India's own JRD Tata found Tata Airlines in 1932, a full decade prior. Can't but admire the vision of this man. By 1946, Tata Airlines had become Air India Limited and was not only servicing local cities within India, but also flying to nearby international destinations. Of course, by 1953, as everybody knows, the government nationalized the air carrier and it went into government hands. About a decade and a half ago, it began making losses, and after several failed attempts at privatization, the airline was finally sold back to the Tata Group for about 18,000 crore. The Tata Group also took on debt of 15,000 crore out of a total debt of about 62,000 crore. The remaining debt still remains with Government of India in a specially created vehicle for this purpose. In January this year, the Tata Group took possession of Air India Express, which is a low-budget operator, and AISATS, which is the ground handling subsidiary. In May, the group appointed Campbell Wilson as MD and CEO of Air India. Mr. Wilson was prior to this CEO of Scoot, which is a low-cost subsidiary of Singapore Airlines, which has been a close partner to the Tata Group in aviation. There was also a convergence of stars, in a manner of speaking. AirAsia, the carrier based out of Malaysia, had a joint venture with the Tatas in India, and they were said to be keen to exit the joint venture. So the Tata Group bought out the entire stake of AirAsia in the India subsidiary. AirAsia India, a low-budget operator, is set to merge with Air India Express by next year. The Tata Group also has a joint venture with Singapore Airlines, and that operator is called Vistara in India. Last week, the duo decided to merge Vistara into Air India, and Singapore Airlines would get a stake of just exceeding 25% in the merged entity. This merger will consummate only by March 2024 because there are international approvals required, and that's the kind of time that it takes. Let us look at the status of airlines in India. From a profitability point of view, the pandemic has been unforgiving. As we all know, that the travel, tourism, and hospitality industry ground to a complete halt. Even now, profitability is only on the horizon. Now, rising fuel costs and foreign exchange losses have combined to become a double whammy for airlines, which means not only have your fuel costs gone, but airlines also have to shell out more rupees per dollar to purchase oil from the global markets. For example, SpiceJet's loss widened to rupees 838 crore for the quarter ended September from 562 crore in the same period last year. IndiGo's loss of 1,583 crore in the same quarter this year was wider than the rupees 1,436 crore loss reported in the year earlier period. Jet Airways began operations in 1993 and gave Air India a run for its money. It made a name for itself in Indian aviation. I remember in the early 2000s, we had US nationals visiting India and flying Jet Airways and insisting emphatically that they hadn't seen such good flight service as they saw with Jet Airways, even back in the US. Unfortunately, the airline got into unsustainable debt and entered insolvency. The Jalan Kalra consortium was the winning bidder at the end of the insolvency process, but right now the winning consortium and the banks that had lent huge funds to the airline are involved in a tussle as to who should shell out the rupees 475 crore in provident fund and gratuity dues to past employees. Over the past year, SpiceJet too has hit the headlines for reasons other than aviation prowess. A maintenance provider to the airline, SR Technics of Switzerland, had a financing arrangement with Credit Suisse, which gave the financing major the right to collect payments from the airline. The Madras High Court had allowed winding up orders against the airline for failing to pay $24 million to SR Technics. In May this year, the parties reached a settlement that allowed for payments in parts. IndiGo, which is currently the big daddy of Indian aviation, too has seen trouble break out between two promoter entities. Allegations of conflict of interest had marred the relationship between founders Rakesh Gangwal and Rahul Bhatia. The latter was appointed managing director of the airline earlier this year, and the other promoter resigned as director of the holding firm and has articulated his plans to pare down stake over the next 5 years. Controversy did not spare the Tata Group either. After Air India came into the Tata fold earlier this year, the group named İlker Ayçi, who was formerly the CEO of Turkish Airlines, in February 2022. But there were objections from Indian political quarters given his own political affiliations in Turkey, and he himself declined the offer 2 weeks after his appointment. This was before Mr. Campbell Wilson came into the fold. Where do airlines stand in India in terms of competition? Let's look at the latest figures released by the DGCA for October across 3 parameters. The first graph shows passenger load factor being high for Go First, SpiceJet, and Vistara. But that is only a measure of capacity for a given number of aircraft in an airline. So now let's look at market share in terms of number of passengers flown. IndiGo is right at the top there, commanding more than half the market. If we combine the market shares of AirAsia, Air India, and Vistara, which are now under a single umbrella, the market share for the Air India group comes to just short of 24%. On-time performance, which is indicative of airline efficiency as well as a lead indicator of future passenger preference, shows Air India coming out tops at Bangalore, Delhi, Hyderabad, and Mumbai. In terms of aircraft at their disposal, IndiGo has a higher count than the combined forces of Air India, but not too far ahead considering it has achieved more than 50% market share individually, with only a delta difference between itself and the AI group. If you look at the individual numbers, the total aircraft for the AI group comes to 220 and IndiGo is only slightly ahead at 289. The specifics are there in the graphic for those interested. These are sourced from company data. What does the future hold for Indian aviation? IndiGo CEO Peter Elbers talks about a full recovery that he's seen in corporate travel in India. In an interview to Business Line last week, he said the carrier operates 1,600 plus flights a day and is seeing interest to even less popular destinations such as Pantnagar, Agra, and Bareilly. In the coming months, if fuel costs temper and the rupee recovers lost ground against the dollar, then the Indian aviation sector has a chance to put its financial woes behind for a bit. As we wind down this episode of Business Matters and I refer to finances, I'm reminded about an old joke in aviation. The question is, how do you become a millionaire? The answer is, start with $1 billion and you'll soon become a millionaire. It's only a joke, and I'm hoping that the aviation sector goes from strength to strength in India. Till the next episode of Business Matters, it's goodbye from us and have a lovely week ahead.